The sound arrives first, not as an explosion, but as a deep tectonic groan tearing through the ether, a frequency felt in the bones before it is heard by the ears. It is the death cry of 30,000 tons of reinforced concrete. Then, the roar. A wall of white water, 50 meters high, liberated from its artificial prison, devours everything in its path. Power stations, barracks, the very light from the sky. This is not footage. It is a phantom, reconstructed from blurry aerial photographs and the feverish imagination of Major Viktor Lebedev, projected onto the back of his skull as he stands in the oppressive silence of a Moscow office. September 1943. The room is a sarcophagus of state power. The air tastes of old cigar smoke and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Not battlefield fear, but the quiet, paralyzing kind that lives in the space between a question and an unacceptable answer. Lebedev, a man whose world is defined by the predictable flow of equations and river currents, holds the evidence of the impossible. Grainy photographs from the British raid on the Ruhr dams. The MHN Dam, severed like a cracked vertebra. The Ader, gutted. The intelligence summary is a masterpiece of omission. It speaks of a bouncing bomb, a skip weapon, terms that sound like childish fantasy. But the results are geological. The method is a void, a blank space on the page that screams of hidden physics. The man behind the desk, a high member of the State Defense Committee, is a silhouette against the weak autumn light. His voice is a dry, administrative instrument, stripping the miracle of all its wonder, leaving only a brutal imperative. The British have solved a problem we believed was insurmountable. They have turned water into a weapon against concrete. Their secret is irrelevant. The effect is what matters. Our enemy controls the Dnieper Cascades, the hydroelectric complexes in the Baltic. These are fortresses. Their power runs German factories. Their reservoirs are defensive moats. They are protected by torpedo nets, flak arrays, and the sheer arrogance of their scale. He leans forward, and the shadow of his form seems to swallow the desk. You will not study this. You will recreate it. You will build a Soviet device capable of replicating this effect. You will provide our long-range aviation with a key to these fortified locks. Lebedev's mind, trained to calculate stress tolerances and hydrodynamic pressure, recoils. He sees the variables, each one a cliff face. The precise low-altitude approach, measured in meters, not kilometers. The impossible stability of a cylindrical object skipping on water at over 300 kilometers per hour. The delayed fuse triggered by hydrostatic pressure, requiring the bomb to sink intact directly against the dam's face. It is not one problem. It is a chain of interconnected impossibilities. A suicide mission for both the weapon and the men who would deliver it. The British used a specific aircraft, a modified, irrelevant, the voice cuts through. You will use what we have, Il-4 torpedo bombers. You have 3 months. When the rivers freeze, the window closes. The front will not wait for the thaw. 3 months. To go from a ghost of an idea to a working weapon. To crack a code written in water and centrifugal force. Lebedev understands now. This is not an engineering task. It is a dark sacrament. He is being asked to believe in a miracle first, then to reverse engineer its mechanics. You will have a team. A special design bureau is being formed at a secure location on the Volga. You will have workshops, test ranges, raw materials, a pause, heavier than the rest, and you will have Alexei Korshunov. The name is a secondary shock. Korshunov, the disgraced prodigy, the aircraft designer who fought bureaucrats as fiercely as he fought aerodynamic drag. A man whose brilliance is matched only by his capacity for defiance. He is not an asset. He is a contained explosion being handed to Lebedev to channel, or to be consumed by. Before Lebedev can form a thought, the door behind him opens. Not the main entrance, but a smaller secondary one he hadn't noticed. A man enters. He does not wear an engineer's tunic, but the uniform of the NKVD, Major Gromov. His face is pale, unlined, and utterly vacant of professional curiosity. His eyes are two dark lenses, absorbing light but reflecting nothing. Major Gromov will be your liaison with the committee, the silhouette says, the euphemism hanging in the air like poison gas. He will facilitate your needs and report on your progress. Daily. Gromov offers no greeting. He simply stares at Lebedev, a silent calibration. His presence transforms the room. The technical challenge is now a race with two finishes lines: success or a bullet in a basement. The threat is no longer abstract failure. It is this quiet man with the authority to turn a calculation error into a charge of sabotage. The meeting ends not with a dismissal, but with a silent transfer of weight. Lebedev is handed a sealed folder, his passport to this purgatory. As he turns to leave, Gromov's voice stops him, flat and final. A vehicle is waiting. Your personal effects have been collected from your apartment. Your family will be informed you are on a critical assignment. You will write to them through approved channels. Say your goodbyes to this office, Comrade Major. You will not return until you have a weapon, or until you are relieved. The walk through the cavernous government hallway is a dreamscape. The clatter of typewriters, the murmur of voices, all are muffled, happening behind thick glass. In his mind, Lebedev is not in Moscow. He is over a pitch-black reservoir, the scream of the engines drowning all thought. The surface of the water a swirling, deadly plane coming up to meet him at a suicidal speed. And in the bomb bay, an artifact of his own creation, a thing that must defy every law of ballistics he holds sacred. The black sedan at the curb is a hearse. As Lebedev slides onto the cold leather seat, the driver, another silent NKVD man, passes him a single object without a word. It is not a document. It is a child's toy. A simple wooden top, a Volchok, its paint chipped from use. Wrapped around it is a scrap of paper, with a single hastily scrawled line in angry handwriting. Forget the British. Why does this work? Korshunov. Lebedev holds the top, its weight negligible. He looks from the humble spinning toy to the mental image of the collapsing dam, the roaring torrent of white water. The chasm between them is the entire mission. The insanity of it closes around him, a perfect, airtight trap. The car pulls away from the curb, moving not through Moscow, but into the heart of an unsolvable equation, with a child's toy as its first and only coefficient. The journey to the Volga was an erasure. 2 days sealed inside the suffocating darkness of the sedan, curtains drawn, the world outside reduced to the rumble of wheels on gravel, and the occasional ghostly flash of headlights through the fabric as they passed another unseen vehicle in the night. For Lebedev, time lost its meaning. He existed in a suspended state, his fingers worrying the smooth wood of the child's top in his pocket, his mind a prisoner of the twin specters, the colossal cascading destruction of the dam, and the chilling vacant eyes of Major Gromov. The vehicle stopped finally, not with a sense of arrival, but as if it had simply run out of road. The door opened to a different kind of darkness, vast and cold, smelling of wet earth, river mud, and the faint metallic tang of industrial decay. They were at the edge of a vast, flat expanse, a peninsula of crumbling concrete jutting into the inky blackness of the Volga. Against a sky salted with indifferent stars, the silhouette of their new home stood like a broken ribcage against the horizon. A derelict, pre-revolutionary river warehouse and a rusted corrugated metal hangar, its doors hanging from twisted hinges. This was not a design bureau. It was a ruin. Inside the hangar, the air was thick with the ghosts of rust and mildew. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a jaundiced pool of light on a scene of organized chaos. This was the special team, not a gathering of esteemed academicians, but a collection of outliers salvaged from the margins of the war effort. Lebedev's eye catalogued them with a sinking heart. At a heavy lathe, a man in a stained quilted jacket worked with a terrifying silent intensity. His movements were economical, brutal, his forearms corded with muscle beneath faded prison tattoos. This was Misha, the genius Zek machinist, for whom precision was not a science but a religion, and whose freedom now depended on the success of this madness. Bent over a plywood board covered in complex, hand-drawn graphs, was Anna, a mathematician evacuated from besieged Leningrad. Her face was pale, all sharp angles and shadows, her eyes burning with a feverish intellect that seemed to feed on the very scarcity around her. She calculated not with slide rules, but with a terrifying, intuitive grasp of chaos, mapping the parabolic suicide of a skipping bomb. In a corner, surrounded by ominous, grease-stained crates marked with black warning stripes, a young man with soot-smudged spectacles, Pavel, meticulously weighed out blocks of pale, dough-like explosive, a pyrotechnician who spoke of detonation velocities and shaped charges with the tender reverence of a poet. And then there was Korshunov. He emerged from the shadows not as a man, but as a force of contained turbulence. He was older than Lebedev expected, his face a landscape of deep lines and smoldering resentment, his hair a wild, gray shock. He wore a leather flight jacket over a civilian sweater, a violation of uniform that was a declaration of war in itself. He did not greet Lebedev. He pointed a finger, stained with machine oil, at the top, still clutched in the engineer's hand. "You've been contemplating the toy." Korshunov's voice was a low rasp, like gravel shifting. "Good. The British overcomplicate. Backspin. A motor in the bomb bay. Complexity is the enemy here. We have no time for elegance." He snatched the top from Lebedev's grasp, set it on a battered metal table, and with a fierce snap of his fingers, sent it spinning. It whirred, a hypnotic, perfect gyroscopic dance. Stability, that is the only miracle we need. Not spin imparted from the plane. Stability inherent in the object itself, a gyroscopic soul. He swept his arm towards the hangar's yawning darkness. "The British bomb jumps. I say we make a bomb that slides, a hydroplane, like a stone, but smarter. We shape it. We weight it. We give it fins not for flight, but for a single skipping trajectory. 3 contacts with the water. 4. No more. Then it sinks where we tell it to sink." It was heresy. It was a complete rejection of the only known, proven principle. Lebedev felt a cold anger rise. They were tasked with replication, not revolution. "We have fragments of their data," Lebedev countered, his voice tight. "The rear rotation is fundamental to the ricochet. To ignore it is to start from zero. We have no zero." "We have less than zero," Korshunov barked, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. The others had stopped their work, watching the clash of titans. We have their result, not their blueprint. To chase their ghost is to fail. We must outthink them, not outcopy them. My concept is simpler. Fewer parts. Less to go wrong in the air, in the cold, under German guns. The debate was cut by the sound of boots on concrete. Major Gromov stood at the entrance to the hangar, a darker patch of shadow in the gloom. He had arrived as silently as a toxin seeping into the bloodstream. He observed the scene, his eyes lingering on the spinning top, then on the heated faces of the two engineers. "A theoretical dispute," Gromov stated, his voice devoid of any interest in theory. "Fascinating. The state requires a practical device. You have 1 week to present a working-scale model for preliminary testing. Wood or plaster, to prove which philosophy floats." A faint, icy smile touched his lips. "Productive debate is encouraged. Lack of progress is noted." He turned and left, leaving a silence more oppressive than before. The deadline was no longer 3 months. It was 7 days. The weight descended, physical, smothering. Work began in a frenzy that blurred night into day. The hangar became a cacophony of shrieking metal, the acrid smell of hot pine from the wood lathe, the constant, tense murmur of Anna's calculations. Lebedev's team, loyal to the ghost of the British design, built a crude, weighted cylinder, attempting to devise a harness to spin it. Korshunov, with Misha the machinist as his devoted acolyte, sculpted a sleek, finned shape from solid pine, its nose weighted with lead, its tail tapered. The rivalry was not personal. It was existential. It was two visions of the impossible colliding in the damp Volga air. They shared the space, the scarce materials, the punishing chill, but they inhabited separate realities. Lebedev's reality was one of respect for the enemy's achievement, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap in understanding. Korshunov's was a defiant act of creation, a belief that the problem demanded not a copy, but a leap into the unknown. At the end of the 7th day, under a leaden dawn sky at the edge of the Volga, both models rested on makeshift trestles. Gromov stood apart, a spectator at a duel. A small motorized launch was ready on the calm, gray water. The first test would be a simple, brutal one, a towed release at low speed. Would the object skip, or would it dive? Lebedev's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not about proving Korshunov wrong. It was about proving that the task itself was not a descent into madness. He gave the signal. The launch engine coughed to life. The moment of truth, reduced to a pull of a cord and the silent flight of 2 carved pieces of wood towards the indifferent surface of the river. The silence that followed the cough of the launch engine stretched into an eternity, a vacuum where only the pounding of Viktor Lebedev's heart had sound. 2 wooden shapes, embodying 2 warring faiths, arced through the damp gray air and struck the flat canvas of the Volga. What happened next was not a test. It was an execution. Lebedev's model, the crude cylinder meant to honor the British principle, hit the water with a sound like a pistol shot. It did not ricochet. It did not skip. It simply shattered. The pine, stressed by its own unbalanced weight and the abrupt impact, exploded into a cloud of splinters and disintegrated shards that peppered the surface like pathetic hail. The complex harness meant to later impart spin was rendered instantly absurd, a tangle of useless wires dragging the largest fragment into the depths. The failure was total, violent, and humiliatingly public. Korshunov's sleek, finned projectile fared differently. which in its own way was worse. It struck the water at its carefully calculated angle, and for one glorious, heart-lifting moment, it behaved as intended. It planed. It skimmed the surface like a gifted flatstone, not bouncing, but sliding, with a smooth, hissing authority. 1 meter, 2. A surge of raw, vindicated triumph began to rise in Korshunov's chest, a fire in his eyes. Then, physics intervened with cruel precision. The inherent stability Korshunov worshipped was a lie for an object of this size and speed. The hydroplane, untouched by gyroscopic force, began to wobble on its longitudinal axis. A slight roll became a violent, corkscrewing tumble. The elegant fins, designed to guide, now caught the water, like grappling hooks. The projectile cartwheeled wildly, shedding its nose weight in a spray of lead, before plunging sideways beneath the surface, leaving only a chaotic swirl of foam. It had not shattered. It had convulsed and drowned. The silence returned, heavier now, thick with the taste of crushed hope. The Volga had rendered its verdict on both gods. The launch engine cut out. In the ringing quiet, the only movement was Major Gromov, slowly lighting a cigarette, the scratch of the match obscenely loud. He did not look at the engineers. He watched the last remnants of splintered wood drift away on the current. "A productive debate," Gromov stated, exhaling a plume of smoke that hung in the still air like a judgment. Both theories demonstrated conclusive failure. The British bomb bounces. Yours sink, or they disintegrate. He finally turned his pale eyes towards them. "You have consumed a week of the state's resources to prove the obvious. Water is hard, and wood is weak. This is not engineering. It is carpentry, and poor carpentry at that." The walk back to the hangar was a funeral procession. The chill of the morning had seeped into their bones, deeper than the cold of the river. Anna, the mathematician, was already scribbling furious notes, her calculations having just been invalidated by reality. Misha, the machinist, stared at his hands, the tools of his genius now feeling blunt and useless. Pavel, the pyrotechnician, looked at his precious explosives with new despair. What use was perfect detonation if the delivery was impossible? Inside the hangar, the atmosphere curdled. The rivalry between the two camps evaporated, replaced by a shared, suffocating dread. They were not competing visions anymore. They were fellow passengers on a ship that had just been shown to have no hull. Korshunov stood before his workbench, not in anger, but in a profound, terrifying stillness. He was staring at the shattered fragments of his model that had been retrieved, his concept lying in broken pieces before him. Lebedev approached, the taste of his own failure still acrid in his mouth. He expected fury, blame, a renewed ideological assault. Instead, Korshunov spoke, his voice hollow, stripped of its earlier fire. "Stability," he murmured, not to Lebedev, but to the ghost of his idea. "The top spins. It does not tumble. Why? Because it rotates. The axis finds the world and holds it." He looked up, and for the first time Lebedev saw not the defiant heretic, but a scientist facing an abyss. "You were right. Backspin. It is not an option. It is the law. The bomb must have a gyroscopic soul before it leaves the plane. It must carry its own stable universe within it." This admission, this surrender from the proudest man Lebedev had ever met, was more frightening than any explosion. It meant they were back at the true monolithic problem, the British secret they could not steal. How do you make a half-ton steel cylinder rotate backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, hanging in the bomb bay of a vibrating, shuddering aircraft, and then release it perfectly into a headwind of 300 kilometers per hour. That night, the hangar was a tomb. The frenetic energy was gone. Men and women worked in silent, hopeless routines. Gromov had installed his own desk in a corner, a clear, unblinking eye. He was no longer just a liaison. He was an auditor of their impending doom. The pressure was no longer about a weapon. It was about survival. Every misstep, every wasted hour was being catalogued not as a technical setback, but as a potential act of sabotage. Lebedev, in a desperate attempt to find any path forward, pored over the scant intelligence photos until his vision blurred. He was looking not at the dams, but at the undersides of the British Lancasters. The grainy images suggested a protruding apparatus, a cylindrical housing. It was a shape, a mechanism. It was nothing. Exhaustion finally claimed him. He fell into a fitful sleep at his desk, his head resting on the blueprints that were now maps to nowhere. In the chaotic dream, the sounds of the hangar, Misha's lathe, Anna's murmuring, the hiss of the single bulb, morphed into the roar of water and the scream of tearing metal. And then a different sound invaded, a high, persistent, whirring hum. It was clean. It was precise. It was the sound of perfect, sustained rotation. Lebedev's eyes snapped open. The hangar was dark, lit only by a single safety lamp. The sound was real. He followed it to its source. In a pool of weak light, Korshunov was hunched over his bench. He was not working on a bomb. He had taken apart a small, complex device, its innards gleaming with polished brass gears and a small, weighted wheel spinning with mesmerizing constancy. It was a gyro compass from a decommissioned naval vessel, scavenged God knows how. Korshunov's hands, stained with oil, were gentle, reverent. He was not building. He was communing. He looked up, and his eyes in the lamplight held a savage, newfound certainty. "We do not need to spin the whole bomb," Korshunov whispered, the words cutting through the oppressive dark. "That is the British brute force. We are not brutes. We need to spin the idea of the bomb. We need a brain that understands down, a brain that will fight any deviation, any wobble, with a gyroscope's will. We give the bomb a spine, a gyroscopic spine. Then we can shape it any way we need. Not their cylinder. Perhaps something else." He held up the tiny, spinning heart of the gyro compass. It hummed, a promise of order in the chaos. It was the first piece of a puzzle they had not even known they were allowed to solve. But the cost of this new path was written in the shadows under Korshunov's eyes, and in the silent, observing presence of Major Gromov across the dark hangar. They had found a direction. Now they had to build a miracle around a stolen, spinning soul, with the clock ticking and the executioner already in the room. The gyro compass hummed on the workbench, a tiny, arrogant king of stability in a world of deliberate chaos. Its sound became the new heartbeat of the hangar, a constant high-frequency reminder of the insane pivot their mission had taken. Korshunov's revelation was not a solution. It was a deeper, more treacherous rabbit hole. They were no longer trying to copy a British bomb. They were attempting to invent a guided creature, a hydrodynamic beast with a gyroscopic nervous system. The concept was a silent pact of rebellion between Lebedev and Korshunov. The rivalry was dead, incinerated in the fire of their shared failure on the Volga. In its place grew a desperate, focused symbiosis. Lebedev's mind, disciplined for systems and integration, now wrestled with Korshunov's wild, architectural leaps. They worked through the night, the harsh light of bare bulbs casting monstrous, shifting shadows of themselves on the corrugated metal walls. Anna's mathematics transformed. Her equations now described not simple ballistics, but the fierce, precessing dance of a gyroscope fighting a torrent of hydrodynamic forces. She mapped the unseen battle that would occur inside the bomb in the milliseconds between each skip. But a theory, even one humming on the bench, was nothing without hardware. They needed not one but dozens of miniature, ruggedized gyroscopic units. They needed servos, linkages, control surfaces strong enough to bite into water at suicidal speeds. These were not items in a Soviet warehouse in 1943. They were fantasies. It was then that Korshunov disappeared. For 2 days, he was simply gone. No word, no explanation. Major Gromov's silent observation took on a new, predatory quality. His cigarette smoke curled in the still air like a question mark. The absence was an open wound in the project's side. Lebedev felt the noose tightening. He drove the team on theoretical work, designing the aerodynamic shell around the phantom gyrobrain. A sleek, dart-like shape Korshunov had dubbed the needle. But it was a body without a soul. On the third morning, Korshunov returned. He looked 20 years older, his clothes smeared with grime and a strange chemical odor. He did not walk into the hangar. He fell into it, followed by 2 sullen, powerfully built men in stained overalls, who were not NKVD, but something rougher, from the shadows of the wartime economy. They carried between them a heavy, unmarked wooden crate. Without a word, they dropped it on the concrete floor, with a sound of ominous fragility. Korshunov dismissed them with a flick of his hand, and a silent exchange Lebedev did not want to understand. As the men vanished back into the dawn mist, Korshunov pried open the crate with a crowbar. The interior was a nest of straw and oiled paper, and within it lay the stolen spine of their weapon. It was not new equipment. It was cannibalized, brutalized, and beautiful. 5 compact German autopilot units, ripped from the guts of downed Heinkel bombers and Focke-Wulf fighters. Their casings were dented, scorched in places, but their mechanical hearts, the precious gyroscopes, and finely machined gimbal assemblies were intact. There were also bundles of German servomotors, their wiring neatly cut, and a stack of aerodynamic control surfaces that looked suspiciously like the trimmed tail fins of Luftwaffe rockets. The air left Lebedev's lungs. This was not procurement. This was treason wrapped in genius. The punishment for unauthorized possession of trophy equipment, especially of this sensitivity, was not a reprimand. It was a firing squad. The hangar fell utterly silent. Misha, the machinist, stared at the German engineering with a mix of horror and lustful appreciation. Anna's hand flew to her mouth. Pavel took a step back, as if from a live bomb. Korshunov's eyes were blazing with exhausted triumph. "They understand stability," he rasped, his voice raw. "The Germans, they understand it in their blood. They're autopilots. They are designed to fight turbulence, to hold a line. We are not building an autopilot. We are building a hydropilot. We teach this German brain a new trick. We make it fight the water." The risk was stratospheric. It was a gamble with their lives as the ante. But the sheer, audacious necessity of it was a powerful narcotic. The German units were a Rosetta Stone, a physical key to the problem of in-flight stability. They could not copy the British method, so they would hybridize it, grafting captured German technology onto a Soviet-born aerodynamic concept. Work exploded into a new, feverish dimension. Misha, his tattooed hands moving with a surgeon's delicacy, began the delicate dissection and adaptation of the autopilots. His prison-honed skills for making anything from nothing were now their greatest asset. Pavel, the pyrotechnician, shifted focus from explosives to the energetics of the servo systems, calculating the forces needed for the control fins to correct a roll in milliseconds. Anna's world became a hell of differential equations, translating the gyroscope's angular momentum into commands for the stolen German servos. And through it all, Major Gromov watched. He did not intervene. He did not question the sudden appearance of high-quality foreign components. He simply observed, his notebook open, his pen moving in short, precise strokes. His silence was more terrifying than any interrogation. It meant he was building a dossier. The crime was being documented, not stopped, allowed to mature into a capital offense should the project fail. He was farming their desperation. A week later, the first integrated prototype was ready. It was a thing of grotesque beauty, a technological chimera. The body was the needle, carved from dense, laminated ash by Misha. Nestled in its core was the modified German gyro unit, a nest of wires snaking out to small metal control fins at the tail. It was powered by a jury-rigged battery pack. It looked less like a bomb and more like a scientific instrument designed by a madman. The test was moved to a small, isolated forest lake at night, under strict blackout conditions. The atmosphere was electric with dread. This was no longer a test of wood on water. It was the first test of an idea that could get them all shot. A simple catapult rig had been built on a rickety pier. Lebedev held his breath as Korshunov, his hands steady for the first time, flipped the power switch. A low, healthy whine emanated from within the ashwood body. The gyroscope was alive. They armed the system. With a thwack of released tension, the prototype was launched over the black, mirror-still water. What happened next was not a perfect success, but it was a miracle. The needle struck the surface, and for a heart-stopping moment seemed to dig in. Then the German brain reacted. The gyro, sensing the violent deviation, sent a frantic signal. The small tail fins bit. The wood groaned in protest, but the nose came up. It didn't skip gracefully. It climbed back out of the water in a shuddering, wet, violent arc. It crashed down again, off-axis, and the process repeated. A series of savage, stuttering, mechanical hops. It was not the elegant flat skid of Korshunov's dream or the ballistic bounce of the British. It was a new, ugly, brutal thing, a controlled stumble across the water. After 4 such convulsive leaps, its battery drained, it finally surrendered and sank. In the profound silence that followed, broken only by the lapping of disturbed water against the shore, there was no cheering. There was awe, and there was terror. It had worked. Not as intended, not beautifully, but it had worked. The gyroscopic spine had fought the water, and, in its own crude way, won. Korshunov turned to Lebedev, his face in the moonlight etched with a savage joy. But Lebedev's eyes were not on him. They were on the far end of the pier, where a single glowing ember marked the presence of Major Gromov. He had seen it all. He had seen the German technology work. He dropped the cigarette, crushing it slowly under his boot heel, the finality of the gesture echoing louder than any explosion. The crime was now a proven concept, and in the eyes of the state, that made it infinitely more dangerous. They had passed a point of no return, not toward success, but into a labyrinth where technical failure and political survival were now the same deadly thing. The success at the forest lake was a poison pill. The euphoria of seeing the jerking, stumbling arc of the needle lasted only as long as the walk back to the vehicles. A cold, silent trek through pitch-black woods where every snapped twig sounded like a rifle bolt. Major Gromov's crushing boot heel on the cigarette had been the full stop on any celebration. They had proven a principle using contraband technology. In the ledger Gromov was keeping, this was not a credit, but a compounding of their debt. The hangar on the Volga was no longer a workshop. It had become the antechamber of a tribunal. The pressure transformed from a diffuse weight into a series of sharp, precise instruments. Gromov's daily presence was a physical constant, a cold spot in the room. He no longer just observed. He dictated. He mandated progress reports in triplicate, demanding quantifiable metrics for the unquantifiable. The stability coefficient of a concept that had stumbled 4 times before sinking. His scrutiny fell on material expenditure, on power consumption from their overtaxed generator, on the very food they ate. Each bolt, each wire, each hour of sleep was now a line item in the case he was building. The technical challenge had morphed. They were past the question of if. Now it was the hellish mathematics of precision. The needle's violent, convulsive hops were a world away from the smooth, predictable ricochets needed to reliably hit a specific point on a dam face hundreds of meters away. The stolen German gyro had reacted, but it was too slow, its corrections too brutal. It was a brain suffering a seizure, not making calculated decisions. Korshunov descended into a monomaniacal focus that bordered on self-annihilation. He and Misha the machinist entered a silent, symbiotic hell, hunched over the stolen autopilot units. They were not engineers anymore, they were surgeons performing experimental brain surgery on a mechanical patient. Korshunov theorized they needed to dampen the gyro's response, to introduce a fluid hydraulic lag between sensor and actuator, forcing the system to anticipate rather than panic. They cannibalized shock absorbers from a wrecked truck, filling them with oils of different viscosities, creating primitive mechanical neurons. The work was microscopic, maddening. A turn of a screw a fraction too far meant overcorrection and a spiral into the water. A turn not enough meant no correction at all. Meanwhile, the real world, the world of war, invaded their sealed bubble. A new presence arrived at the compound. Captain Irina Sokolova, a test pilot from the Long-Range Aviation Regiment. Her arrival was a bucket of ice water on their theoretical machinations. She was a young woman with an old face, her eyes holding the flat, 1,000-yard stare of someone who had flown too many missions into the flak-filled nights over Germany. She was not there to consult. She was there to learn the weapon they did not yet have. Her presence made the abstraction concrete, and the concrete was terrifying. She studied their models, their diagrams, and asked questions that were like scalpels. "Release altitude," she asked, her voice devoid of inflection. 10 meters, Korshunov stated, not looking up from his gyro. Sokolova did not react. She simply pulled a reference book from her flight jacket, a pilot's manual for the IL-4 bomber, and laid it open on the bench. It was 3 centimeters thick. She placed her hand horizontally 10 centimeters above it. This is 10 meters. This is the manual. At that altitude, over uneven terrain or water, my radio altimeter is a suggestion. My static ports could ice. A downdraft of 2 meters per second means we strike the surface. You are not asking for a bombing run. You are asking for a controlled crash, repeated 7 times, in the dark, over water rippled by wind you cannot see. Her words hung in the air, a new layer of impossibility. They had been fighting the water. She introduced the enemy they had forgotten, the air itself. Lebedev watched the interaction, a new chill seizing him. They were crafting a delicate neurological instrument to be used in the heart of a hurricane. Sokolova moved to a chalkboard and, with the casual precision of a seasoned navigator, began drawing the attack profile. A low-level approach at treetop height for 30 kilometers to avoid radar. A final descent to the killing altitude. The release point calculated not just for distance, but for the bomb's specific, stuttering skip pattern. A violent, climbing turn to escape the blast and the colossal column of water. Each step was a lottery ticket, with death. The British lost 8 of 19 aircraft on one raid, Sokolova stated, erasing the profile as if it were a bad memory. Their pilots knew the weapon. They had trained for months over reservoirs in England. My crew will have weeks, days. They will be tired from combat missions. You are asking them to perform a symphony of precision while exhausted, in the dark, with Germans trying to kill them. She finally looked at Lebedev, her gaze unwavering. Your bomb must be perfect, not good. Perfect, or you are not sending us on a mission. You are writing our obituary. Her bluntness was not hostility. It was the most profound professionalism. It shattered the last remnants of academic detachment. The machine on the bench was no longer a puzzle. It was a component in a larger, more fragile machine made of flesh, courage, and highly volatile aviation fuel. Gromov absorbed this exchange with clinical interest. He saw not the human tragedy, but a new variable for his calculus of blame. Pilot error, training deficit, the failures of the Air Force Command. The avenues for deflecting responsibility from his oversight were multiplying. Driven by this brutal new reality, the team entered a final, desperate sprint. The first full-scale prototype, dubbed Volna, the Wave, was taking shape. It was a monstrous, sinister-looking dart of sheet steel 2 meters long. Inside its pregnant belly sat the modified, hybridized German-Soviet gyropilot, now fed by a custom-built hydraulic system Misha had forged from scavenged parts. It was ugly, heavy, and terrifyingly real. The final pre-flight test was to be the ultimate trial. Not on a lake, but against a surrogate target. Gromov, seizing the initiative, had identified a location. A derelict, low concrete weir on a remote stretch of river. A relic of a forgotten mill. It was not a dam, but it was hard, static, and vertical. The test would be conducted at dawn, under full security blackout. A catapult system was impossible for the full-scale Volna. It would have to be dropped from a low-flying truck speeding along a specially built trestle over the water. It was a crude, dangerous simulation, but it was all they had. The night before the test, the hangar was a portrait of silent, collective anxiety. Pavel performed the final arming of the inert practice charge, a concrete block shaped like an explosive lens. Anna ran her final simulations, her face pale. Misha made minute, loving adjustments to the hydraulics with a touch lighter than a breath. Korshunov and Lebedev stood before the Volna. It gleamed dully under the work lights, a thing of profound, menacing purpose. All their stolen technology, their sleepless nights, their theoretical leaps, were coiled inside that steel skin. "We have given it a spine," Korshunov murmured, his voice hoarse. "Tomorrow we see if it has a will." Lebedev looked past the bomb to where Irina Sokolova sat alone, polishing her flight navigator's wristwatch with a methodical, ritualistic intensity. She was preparing for a test she was not yet part of, calibrating the instrument that would measure the microseconds of their success or failure. Her composure was more unsettling than any panic. He understood then. The true test tomorrow was not of the Volna's ability to skip. It was a test of their right, as engineers hiding in a ruin on the Volga, to ask a woman like that to fly it into hell. The price of a millimeter's error in the gyro, a meter's mistake in altitude, was no longer a technical footnote in a failed report. It was a fireball on a dark lake, a name on a memorial. The weight was no longer on their shoulders. It was in their stomachs, a cold, leaden stone of absolute responsibility. The countdown to dawn was the longest of their lives. Dawn did not break over the remote river weir. It leaked, a slow gray seepage of light that bled color from the world, leaving everything in shades of iron and ash. The air was frigid, carrying the damp, rotten scent of decaying reeds and chilled mud. The concrete weir, their surrogate target, stood across the narrow river like a fallen tombstone, stained with water lines and moss, a pathetic imitation of the monumental dams it was meant to represent. Yet, in the half-light, it looked indestructible. The test rig was an obscenity of improvisation. A wooden trestle, built in frantic haste by soldiers who asked no questions, extended 20 meters over the water, ending in a rough, downward-sloping ramp. A heavy ZIS truck, its engine block reinforced, its rear axle straining, was positioned at the start of this makeshift runway. In its open bed, held by a complex, sprung-release mechanism designed by Misha, sat the Volna. The bomb looked utterly alien in this setting. Its sleek, sinister steel dart form, the product of stolen technology and sleepless genius, seemed to hum with a latent violence against the crude wood and rusting truck. It was a predator caged in a chicken coop. The team stood shivering at the riverbank, a small, isolated cluster of shadow against the vast, indifferent landscape. Major Gromov stood apart, nearer to the weir, a pair of field glasses hanging from his neck, a camera on a tripod beside him. He was not there to witness an experiment. He was there to collect evidence. Captain Sokolova had also come, a silent observational ghost, her eyes tracking every detail of the preparation, mentally translating it to the cockpit of her IL-4. The tension was a physical substance, thicker than the river mist. It had a taste, copper and bile. Lebedev's hands were numb, but not from the cold. Every calculation, every soldered wire, every ounce of hope was now loaded into that truck bed. Korshunov stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the Volna, as if he could command its performance by sheer will. Anna clutched her notepad to her chest, her pages filled with numbers that were about to be proven prophetic or meaningless. Pavel had retreated a few steps, his pyrotechnician's instinct repelled by the impending violence of impact. A soldier raised a red flag. The signal. The truck's engine roared. A shocking, brutal sound that tore the silent dawn to shreds. It lurched forward, gears grinding, its tires spitting splinters from the trestle timbers. It gathered speed, a lumbering beast trying to achieve grace. The trestle groaned and shuddered under the weight. Lebedev's breath caught. This was madness. It was too fast, too crude. As the truck reached the end of the ramp, Misha, perched perilously in the back, yanked the release lever. The Volna dropped. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to simply fall, a dead weight. Then it struck the water. The sound was not a splash, It was a sickening, wet smack of immense force, like a giant hammer hitting a side of beef. A geyser of white water erupted, obscuring everything. Hart stopped. Then a shape emerged from the spray, the Volna, shedding a curtain of foam. And it was skipping. Not the violent, stuttering stumble of the Forest Lake prototype. This was different. The full-scale hydraulics, the tuned gyro brain, the sheer mass. It all came together in a terrifying, beautiful display of controlled chaos. It skipped once, a long, flat, skimming arc that carried it halfway to the weir. The sound was a deep, tearing hiss. It hit again and again, each contact shorter, harder, the gyro fighting to keep the nose up as velocity bled away. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips. It was a sequence of brutal, precise geometry written on the river's surface. On the fifth and final impact, it was perfectly aligned. It did not skip. It dove. The nose, weighted and shaped by Pavel's inert charge, bit into the water just meters from the weir's face and vanished. A second of absolute, breathless silence. Then, the world exploded. The water at the base of the weir bulged upward, a pregnant, swelling dome that swallowed the light. A muffled, thunderous crump rolled over them, a pressure wave that hit the chest before the sound hit the ears. The dome erupted. A column of water, concrete shards, and mud blasted 30 meters into the air. The ancient weir shuddered. A massive, jagged crack, black against the gray concrete, raced up its face from the waterline. Chunks of masonry the size of armchairs calved away and crashed into the roiling maelstrom. The river itself seemed to recoil, then surge back, a miniature, furious tsunami washing over the banks. For a full 10 seconds, there was only the roar of collapsing water and falling debris. Then silence again, deeper than before, ringing with the aftermath. They had done it. The shock of it was paralyzing. It was a feeling beyond joy, a visceral, stunning triumph against the laws of probability. Korshunov let out a sound that was half sob, half roar. His fists clenched at the sky. Misha, still on the shattered remnants of the trestle, sank to his knees. Anna's notepad fell into the mud, forgotten. Even Pavel grinned, a wild, uncharacteristic expression of victory. Captain Sokolova's analytical mask slipped for a fraction of a second. In her eyes, Lebedev saw a flash of pure professional awe, the recognition of a tool that could actually do the impossible job asked of it. Then the mask reset, and she was already calculating run-in angles and release points in her head. Lebedev himself felt a surge of elation so powerful it was dizzying. They had taken a ghost of an idea, mixed it with contraband and defiance, and birthed a real, breathing weapon. The Volna worked. His eyes found Major Gromov. Gromov was not looking at the celebrating engineers. He was bent over his camera, carefully winding the film. He then lifted his field glasses and trained them, not on the cheering team, but on the damaged weir. He studied the crack, the scattered debris. After a long minute, he lowered the glasses and made a note in his small, black book. His face was expressionless, but his actions were a glacial bath poured over the moment. He walked towards them, his boots crunching on wet gravel. The celebratory silence of the team died, replaced by a new, wary tension. Gromov stopped before Lebedev and Korshunov. He did not congratulate them. The kinetic impact and hydrostatic shock were sufficient to fracture a degraded, non-reinforced concrete structure approximately 4 meters wide and 6 meters high, he stated, his voice flat, reciting a clinical report. The explosive charge was inert, A live warhead of equivalent size would have produced a larger water displacement and a more impressive spectacle. But the structural result would be similar: significant damage, not catastrophic failure. He paused, letting the words sink in. The euphoria curdled, turning acidic in their stomachs. The German dams targeted by the British were over 40 meters high. Their concrete was reinforced, their foundations engineered. The hydrostatic pressure at their base was an order of magnitude greater. To breach such a structure requires not a crack, but a hole measuring tens of meters across. This requires not 100 kilograms of explosive. It requires 1,000, perhaps more. He looked from the shattered weir to the Volna's sleek, now proven form, then back to the engineers. The finality in his gaze was absolute. You have succeeded in creating a delivery method for a small tactical charge. You have not created a weapon to destroy strategic dams. The IL-4 bomber cannot lift a warhead of the required mass and fly at 10 meters. It is a physical impossibility. The aircraft does not exist in our inventory. He closed his notebook with a soft, definitive snap. The project has reached its logical conclusion. You have demonstrated a fascinating technical principle. The state has more pressing needs for resources, aircraft, and engineers. You will prepare a final report. Your team will be disbanded and reassigned. Gromov turned and walked back towards his waiting car, leaving them standing in the ruins of their victory, the cold mud soaking into their boots, the glorious, roaring success revealed as nothing more than a beautifully engineered, utterly useless lie. The true enemy was not the water, nor the gyroscope, nor the altitude. It was the relentless, unforgiving arithmetic of mass, energy, and concrete. They had won the battle of physics, and in doing so, had lost the war. The return from the river weir was not a journey. It was a deportation. The silence in the truck that carried them back to the hangar was a tangible, heavy entity, thick with the residue of evaporated triumph and the cold certainty of defeat. The euphoric image of the exploding water column had fossilized in their minds, now recast not as a victory, but as a grotesque parody, a firecracker against the fortress wall of reality. Major Gromov's clinical autopsy of their success played on a loop in the aching hollow of Viktor Lebedev's skull. Significant damage, not catastrophic failure. The words were a tombstone for 3 months of stolen sleep, stolen technology, and stolen hope. The hangar, which had been a crucible of creation, transformed overnight into a morgue for ideas. The order was absolute. The project was terminated. The Special Design Bureau was to cease all activity. All materials, prototypes, and documentation were to be inventoried, crated, and prepared for shipment to a state archive, or more likely, a furnace. The sense of dissolution was swift and merciless. The generator was shut off, plunging the space into a gloom that matched their spirits. The constant, purposeful cacophony of lathes, arguing voices, and scribbling calculations was replaced by the hollow, mournful sounds of packing. The scrape of wood on concrete, the dry rustle of paper, the final, definitive clang of toolboxes being locked. Major Gromov oversaw the dismantling with the efficiency of a forensic cleaner. He moved through the space, a specter of bureaucratic finality, ticking items off a master list. His earlier ominous silence was gone, replaced by a cold, procedural clarity. The crime of potential had been settled. The sentence was oblivion. The team unraveled like a complex machine hitting its end stop. Anna, the mathematician, carefully gathered her sheaves of calculations. her beautiful, chaotic maps of impossible trajectories. With a methodical, emotionless motion, she fed them page by page into the small cast-iron stove used for heating, watching the flames consume the proof of their intellectual passion, turning differential equations into fragile black ghosts that rose up the chimney. Her face was blank, the firelight reflected in her glasses, hiding her eyes. Pavel, the pyrotechnician, surrendered his precious blocks of explosives and intricate detonators to stony-faced men from the Arsenal Directorate. He did not watch them go. He simply sat on an empty crate, polishing his spectacles over and over, his world of precise, energetic release rendered irrelevant. Misha, the machinist, faced the hardest task. He was ordered to dismantle the Volna itself. His hands, which had given the weapon its physical form with such devotion, now had to unmake it. He approached the sleek, sinister dart not as an engineer, but as a butcher. The whine of his power tools taking apart the housing was a sound of violation. He removed the hybrid German-Soviet gyroscopic brain they had labored so horrifically to create. He held the complex nest of gears, gimbals, and hydraulic dampers in his hands for a long moment. A stolen, adapted, brilliant mind now declared stillborn. Then, with a grunt of something that was neither anger nor sorrow but profound exhaustion, he dropped it into a crate marked for scrap metal. The thud of its landing was the loudest sound in the hangar. Korshunov watched this dismemberment from a distance. Leaning against the wall where his workbench had been, he did not help. He did not protest. He was a statue of spent defiance. All his heresy, his theft, his visionary leaps had been for nothing. The system had allowed him to run to the very edge of the possible, only to point out the abyss beyond. The fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the flat gray ash of comprehension. He was not being punished for failure. He was being rendered obsolete. His dangerous mind was being packed away in a wooden box. Only Captain Irina Sokolova's departure carried a different kind of weight. She had arrived with the stark reality of the cockpit, and she left with its quiet dignity intact. She packed her navigation tools, her flight charts, her personal chronometer. Before she left, she sought out Lebedev. She did not offer sympathy. She looked at him with the same direct, unflinching gaze she had used to dissect their attack profile. "You built what they asked for," she said, her voice low and even. "It worked. It would have been hell to fly, but it would have worked. For the target they gave you at the end, it was the wrong question." She paused, her eyes glancing at the carcass of the Volna. "We spend our lives answering the wrong questions. It's the only way to sometimes accidentally find a right answer. Just not today." She offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a salute from one professional to another, acknowledging a shared defeat, then turned and walked out of the hangar, back to her war of tonnage and attrition, of high-altitude bombing runs, where success was measured in square kilometers of rubble, not millimeters of gyroscopic correction. And then it was Lebedev's turn. Gromov summoned him to the now bare office corner. The dossier was complete. The verdict had been passed in Moscow. Lebedev's engineering career was over. His expertise, tainted by association with a cancelled project and a problematic collaborator, was no longer required in any research bureau. But the state was at war. The front needed sappers, men who understood explosives, stress points, and the behavior of structures under force. "Your skills have practical application, Comrade Major," Gromov stated, handing him new orders. The paper was crisp, official. You are transferred to the 42nd Engineer Sapper Battalion of the 2nd Belarusian Front, effective immediately. You will depart on the evening transport. Your commission is reduced to the rank of Senior Sergeant, reflecting your new combat role. It was not a sentence to a camp. It was something perhaps more cruel, a sentence to utility. All his knowledge, the delicate understanding of hydrodynamics and gyroscopic precession, was to be buried in the mud of the front, used to clear minefields and blow up wooden bunkers. It was the absolute, final negation of the dream that had begun in that Moscow office. He was not being punished for thinking too big. He was being recycled for thinking at all. As Lebedev turned to go, his few personal possessions in a duffel bag, Gromov spoke one last time, not looking up from his final report. The technical data will be archived. The principles demonstrated may have peripheral applications. Your team's work is not a total loss. It is a lesson in the constraints of material reality. That, too, has value for the state. The words were a hollow epitaph. A lesson. Their creation was now a cautionary tale in a classified file. Lebedev took one last look at the hangar. It was just an empty, rusting shell again, smelling of oil and defeat. Korshunov was gone, escorted by a different set of guards, his fate a separate, darker mystery. The others had already dispersed into the machinery of the war, their brief, brilliant alliance erased. He walked out into the fading light, the duffel bag heavy on his shoulder. He was no longer an architect of miracles. He was a sapper, a digger in the dirt. The grand, insane vision of a bomb skipping across water to kill a concrete giant was dead. All that remained was the long, grinding train ride east towards the thunder of artillery that solved problems not with finesse, but with raw, obliterating mass. The Volga was behind him, and with it, the ghost of a weapon that had flown, just once, perfectly, and for nothing. The war ended, not with a bang for Senior Sergeant Viktor Lebedev, but with a slow, grinding deceleration into a silence that was itself a new kind of noise. The thunder of artillery was replaced by the groan of shattered cities settling, the screams of the wounded by the low, constant murmur of displacement. His sapper's war had been a tactile, intimate hell of mud, fear, and the patient, deadly geometry of German minefields. He diffused teller mines, not with equations, but with sweating palms and a wire-cutter's instinct. He blew bridges using calculations of stress that were crude, brutal, and effective. The elegant physics of the skipping bomb felt like a fever dream from another lifetime. A delusion of grandeur scrubbed clean by the crude, honest pragmatism of high explosives and human sweat. In the spring of 1945, his battalion was tasked with clearing the ruins of a strategic hydroelectric complex on the Oder, one of the many concrete claws the Germans had sunk into the flesh of conquered Europe. It was not a dam of mythic proportions, but a mid-sized regulator structure, its control house shattered by aerial bombs, its sluice gates twisted shut by the heat of battle. The work was methodical, dangerous. The structure was unstable, laced with demolition charges that had failed to detonate, a final spiteful gesture from the retreating enemy. Lebedev moved through the dripping, cavernous interior of the intake structure, his boots scraping on grit and shattered tile, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was cold and smelled of wet concrete, rot, and the pungent, sweet odor of old explosives. He was checking the anchoring points of a main sluice gate, looking for telltale wires or the sinister olive drab of a booby-trapped charge, when his light caught a peculiar pattern on the massive steel-reinforced concrete wall. It was a wound, but not from a bomb strike. A bomb strike left radial cracks, a sunburst of violence. This was different. A long, deep, almost surgical incision ran vertically up the wall from the waterline, as if a giant's chisel had bitten in and been dragged upwards. Around this central tear, the concrete was not shattered, but bruised, a massive, circular area of spalling where the surface had fractured into a million hairline cracks and been pushed inward, only to hold. It was a damage profile he had never seen from artillery, from aerial bombs, from any conventional weapon. It spoke of an immense focused, subsurface force. Lebedev's breath caught in his throat. The clinical chill of the ruin vanished. The world narrowed to the circle of light on the wall. He knew this signature, intimately. He had seen it in miniature, etched into the shattered face of the weir on the Volga. This was the mark of a hydrostatic hammer, the result of a substantial explosive charge detonating not against the wall, but in perfect, intimate contact with it, underwater, using the water itself as an anvil to deliver a catastrophic, focused blow. It was the principle of his own stillborn weapon, but executed here with a larger, more powerful payload. His mind, long dormant in that specific technical compartment, ignited. This was not Allied work. The Allies had pummeled this complex from the air with general-purpose bombs. This was precise, deliberate, underwater demolition. German. A defensive measure taken too late, or perhaps a test. He scrambled down, ignoring the shouted warnings of his squad mates, and waded into the frigid, debris-choked water at the base of the structure. His hands, numb with cold, felt along the scarred concrete near the incision. And there, half buried in silt and rust, his fingers brushed against twisted, familiar metal. He pulled it free. It was a mangled fin assembly, not Soviet, not British. The shape was unmistakably Teutonic, with a complex, windmill-like twist to its vanes, designed not for aerodynamic stability in air, but for hydrodynamic control in water. It was a guidance fin from a submersible, self-propelled ordnance, a German underwater projectile. Standing there, chest deep in the dark water, clutching the twisted metal, the final crushing irony descended upon him. They had spent themselves trying to reverse engineer a British ghost, while the enemy they sought to defeat had been walking a parallel, darker path. The Germans had not sought to skip bombs. They had been developing something more logical, more sinister. A guided underwater charge, a submerged predator that would swim beneath the nets and defenses to place its explosive heart directly against the dam's foundation. Their own stolen gyroscopes, their desperate hybrid, had been a clumsy cousin to this sleek, purpose-built killer. The Volna had been the right answer to the wrong question, while the enemy had been calmly asking a more lethal one. The discovery was a phantom pain, a glimpse into a shadow war of technologies that never quite clashed. He reported the find. The fin was catalogued as a trophy, and the war moved on, leaving the mystery of the scarred wall unexplained in the official reports. The epilogue unfolded years later in the clipped, stark reality of 1947. The world had been rebuilt into a tense, new shape. Lebedev, his engineering rank partially restored due to his frontline service, worked in a gray, anonymous design bureau outside Moscow, reviewing foreign technical documents. It was drudgery, sifting through the dry leavings of the war's technological harvest. One afternoon, a sealed packet arrived from the Trophy Technical Commission. It was marked with a string of classified codes and a simple title: German Experimental Hydrodynamic Ordnance, Series Seehund Seal. With a numbness born of routine, Lebedev broke the seal and spread the contents on his desk. There were schematic diagrams, test reports translated into clumsy Russian, and photographs. His heart stopped. Before him were detailed blueprints for a German pilotless submersible, a torpedo-like vehicle designed for attacking port facilities, and, the notes suggested, the submerged foundations of dams. Its guidance system was a marvel of compact, ruthless engineering, a gyroscopic autopilot derived from aircraft systems coupled with a depth sensor and steering fins almost identical to the one he had pulled from the Oder wreckage. But it was the final photograph that held him transfixed. It showed a test model, recovered from a lake in Bavaria. And there, scribbled in the margin by some anonymous Soviet technician, was a note: modification for surface skimming trials observed. Concept similar to 1943-44 domestic project Volna. Refer to archive file GSH 773. Domestic project Volna. The words burned. Their project had a file number. It had been archived. And someone, in the bowels of the Soviet military technical complex, had made the connection. The door to his office opened. A young, eager engineer, new from the university, placed another folder on his desk. Comrade Lebedev, the preliminary sketches for the new coastal defense rocket system. They want your assessment of the sustainer stage stability issues. The designers are complaining about lateral drift at low altitude over water. Lebedev looked from the faded German blueprints to the fresh, crisp Soviet schematics. The new project was for a rocket that would fly low over the sea to avoid radar, skipping the boundary between air and water, a concept they called sea skimming. The instability problem was in the roll axis during the terminal phase. A cold, clear understanding, decades in the making, finally crystallized. It was not about dams. It never had been. It was about control. Control of an unstable body moving at the violent interface between two mediums. The bouncing bomb, the German Seehund, the sea-skimming rocket. They were all variations on the same brutal equation. He picked up a pencil, his hand steady. On a fresh sheet of tracing paper, he began to sketch. Not the new rocket. He drew from memory. He drew the core of the Volna's guidance system, the hybrid gyroscopic brain, the hydraulic dampers Misha had forged, the principle of using a spinning soul to fight the chaos of a fluid world. He annotated it with the lessons from the German schematics, the efficiency of their fin design, the elegance of their sensor integration. He pushed the sketch across the desk to the young engineer. Lateral drift at the interface, Lebedev said, his voice quiet but firm with a hard-won authority. The problem is not in the sustainer. It is in the autopilot's response time. It is panicking. It needs to anticipate. Here. He tapped his drawing. This is a gyroscopic control system with a damped, hydraulic feedback loop. We built it once. It was for a different weapon, a weapon that failed. But the principle understood the water. Take this. Show them. Tell them it is not a new idea. It is an old lesson, paid for in advance. The young engineer stared at the complex, elegant sketch, then at Lebedev's weathered, implacable face. He did not see a failed bomb designer. He saw the source of a solution. Lebedev leaned back. He looked out the window at the gray Moscow sky. The ghost of the Volna was no longer a specter of failure. It was a fossil, embedded in the bedrock of progress. Its true explosion was not one of water and concrete, but of understanding, a delayed, echoing blast that would guide the next generation of weapons, and the one after that. They had not broken a dam, but in their desperate, flawed, magnificent struggle, they had charted a hidden path through the chaos. And sometimes that was the only victory history ever granted.